Thank you, thank you. Welcome. Bom dia, as they say in Portuguese. My name is Rich. I work here at Rick Steves as a travel consultant, so I help a lot of independent travelers plan their trips to Europe. I also have done book research in Portugal several times and traveled there independently quite a bit. So I know Portugal really well, and it's one of my favorite spots. People often ask me, what's your favorite place in Europe? And I have to say, it's hard to pick just one. Portugal is definitely in the top 2 or 3, I would say. People will often say, well, why Portugal? What's so great about Portugal? Well, I would say, why not Portugal? What's not great about Portugal? There's so many great things about Portugal. And so I'll talk about that during this talk and show you guys some pictures and hopefully get you excited to go to one of my favorite travel destinations. So most of you probably already know where Portugal is located. It's in the far southwest corner of Europe. And it's surrounded on one side by, actually on 2 sides, the north and the east by Spain, and on the west and the south by the sea. So it's pretty geographically isolated from the rest of Europe. It has some common history with Spain, but one thing I will say is Portugal is not Spain. I'm going to repeat that. Portugal is not Spain. If you go to Portugal and you speak Spanish, you will not impress Portuguese people by speaking Spanish. If you come across somebody in the countryside or at a store who doesn't speak any English, then if you speak Spanish, you can ask them, do you speak Spanish? And almost every Portuguese person will understand Spanish if they don't even speak it. So then you can go into Spanish. But you'll get a lot further actually in Portugal by speaking English. Portugal has a very long relationship with Great Britain. They actually have the longest alliance in the world, mostly due to their mutual dislike of the Spanish. So there's a lot of British people that go to Portugal. A lot of Brits will winter in Portugal, especially in the south on the Algarve coast, and all the port wine lodges in the north in Porto are actually owned by Brits. So Portugal is actually a fairly small country. It's about 35,000 square miles, about the size and shape of Indiana. So you could actually drive from the far north up here near the Spanish border, all the way down to the Algarve coast in about 6.5 hours if you drove straight through. If you're coming from Spain here in the east and you were to drive all the way to the little tip, Sagres, in the southwest corner, that's about 2.5 hours. So it's a relatively small geographic area. Lisbon, the capital, is the largest city. That's where a great deal of the population lives. And then the second biggest city is Porto in the north. There's also quite a bit of variation in territory. So from the north part of the country is pretty mountainous and green, a little more wet, and the south is a little more dry and arid, especially in the summertime. So one of the things I really like about Portugal is the landscape. It's a beautiful country. So in the north you have the Douro Valley with these old terraced hillsides, wine grapes. They've grown wine here since Roman times. Lots of varieties of wine that you've never heard of, actually. In the south you have the Alentejo region, which this is taken in the spring. So it's pretty green, but usually this area is very hot and dry. A lot of cork trees, a lot of olive trees, also a lot of grapes. It's the second biggest wine producing area. Portugal has over 350 miles of coastline, so that means lots and lots of beaches. Beautiful beaches, mostly sandy beaches. So if you like the beach, it's a great place to go. Has some vibrant big cities like Lisbon and Porto, as well as some really nice, charming small towns like Óbidos. Very unique architecture. So this is a type of architecture that's really only found in Portugal. It's called Manueline, after King Manuel. And it's sort of an interesting mix of Gothic and Moroccan. So it's kind of very distinct that you will see in different parts of Portugal. Also, the people in Portugal are very friendly people. They're very humble, very friendly. If you even just learn a couple phrases in Portuguese, they will go out of their way to be nice to you. So it's a very easy place to travel, a very safe country to travel. I used to say Portugal was kind of an unknown, out-of-the-way place, but that's certainly not true in the last couple years. It's really been discovered, and now it's a really hot destination. A lot of people are going to Portugal. So one of the reasons that people go to Portugal, or one of the things you think about when you think about Portugal, is port wine. So not only port wine, they also have a lot of really good table wine that you've never heard of. Most of it's small production, so you can't really find it outside of Portugal, but in Portugal itself, you can drink very good wine very cheaply. This is one of my favorites. It's a kind of a light, sparkling white wine called Vinho Verde, slightly effervescent, it's really good on a hot day. And Portugal is the largest producer of cork in the world. So whenever you open your wine bottle, whether it's a bottle of wine from Italy or from France, most likely that cork comes from Portugal itself. It comes from the bark of the cork tree, and they actually peel it off in sheets. And people often think, aren't they going to kill the tree? But actually, it takes about 7 years for the cork to grow back, and these trees can last up to 100 years. So, big production there. The tiles you will see all over Portugal. This is a type of tile called azulejo. I'm not sure I'm still saying that right. It's a really hard word for English speakers. But mostly blue and white tiles, but you will see lots of different colors of tiles. Entire buildings covered in tiles in Portugal. And it's one of the things about Portugal that I really like. It's very different than architecture that you'll see in other places. Also, one of the very distinctly Portuguese things that you won't find anywhere else is fado music. And fado is this sort of soulful, almost sad, longing type of music. And when you think about it, Portugal's surrounded by the sea. The men were off at sea for months on end. So their wives, their daughters, their sisters were at home. And they would miss their husbands, their boyfriends, their sons. And so they would have this sort of longing sadness, and they would sing these songs. And the really best place to hear fado is in Lisbon, but you can hear it all over Portugal. Another distinctly Portuguese term is called saudade, which doesn't really translate into English, but it sort of means like this longing for something in the past, something that's gone. And some people say the Portuguese people it sort of permeates a lot of parts of their being. They have this sort of almost the sadness of the past. Since Portugal is surrounded by the sea, fishing is a huge part of their culture, and there's lots of fresh seafood. If you like seafood, Portugal is a fantastic place to go. One of the biggest types of fish that you will see in Portugal is cod, and it comes in dried sheets like this. This is actually one of our Norwegian tour guides, Paul Johansson, and one of our Portuguese tour guides, Cristina Duarte. And I think they're negotiating some trade deal here, Portuguese wine for Norwegian cod. Most of the cod actually comes from Norway. It's been completely fished out of the waters around Portugal. So it comes from Norway or even Iceland. They have over 365 different recipes for cod. So they can make cod any number of ways. This is one of the most popular. They're little cod fritters called pastéis de bacalhau. Another very popular dish in Portugal is pork and clams. So it sounds kind of odd. You think, pork and clams, why would they put that together? It's actually quite tasty. Portuguese cuisine is not something that's really known worldwide. I mean, you can go anywhere and find Italian food or French food, but Portuguese food is more basic. It's a lot of fish and potatoes, a lot of fresh seafood, but it is a very hearty, very tasty food. And now, with the resurgence of all this tourism in Portugal, there's a lot of really designer food. You can do these really fancy food tours in Lisbon and Porto. A lot of their chefs are taking traditional Portuguese dishes and putting this modern twist on them, and it's a very trendy kind of hip thing right now. Another popular Portuguese dish that you might see in Portugal is a type of bread soup. It's called a sorda, and there's probably 1,000 different recipes for this. It's like in the US potato salad, everyone has their own recipe. In Portugal, it's basically the same thing. It's a chicken broth, but then and dried old bread, usually stale bread. But then what they put in it varies. This particular one has cilantro in it, and then they put a raw egg on top, and the heat from the soup cooks it. Especially in the Alentejo region, this is a very popular dish. Sardines, and these are different than the sardines you will find in a can. These are really large grilled sardines. And quite tasty. I don't even like sardines, but first time I came to Portugal and tried these, I was skeptical, but they're very delicious. Octopus salad, another very common dish that you will find there. And this is a Brazilian barbecue called churrasco. And if you like meat, if you're a meat eater, you will be in heaven there. You can find these very affordable kind of meat buffets all over Portugal. And these guys come to your table with these different cuts of meat on these skewers, and then they carve them onto plates at your table. In the back, you have this kind of big salad bar that has different vegetables and salads, and you can go eat. But if you like to eat a lot of meat, this is definitely a good value for you when you're in Portugal. One of the most common and very affordable dishes is peri-peri chicken. It's a roast chicken, and then they have this very spicy little sauce here called peri-peri sauce that they put on it. Almost always served with French fries and salad. And then this is a dish that's common to Porto in the north. It's called a francesinha, which means a little French girl. It's sort of like a croque monsieur, if you've had that in France. And it's a ham and cheese sandwich that's then wrapped in cheese and baked, and then it's covered in this kind of gravy that has beer in it. I call it the Portuguese gut bomb. It definitely is going to feel like you have a brick in your stomach if you eat this, but it is quite tasty. So if you're going to travel to Portugal, it is a fairly easy place to travel. Quite a few people speak English there. They're very friendly people. I would definitely come armed with some good materials. I'm a little partial to our guidebooks since I'm one of the people who updates them. Our guidebooks are not all-inclusive, though. So Rick has already sort of taken out what he thinks is the best of the best and put it in this book. We've kind of already narrowed down the choices. But if there's some place that you want to go that your grandparents came from, or you just heard about some little town in the mountains that you want to explore, then you might want to look at a different type of guidebook. And for those, I usually use Lonely Planet. They're much more extensive than ours. They're maybe not updated as often, but they have a much more wide coverage. And then the DK series, I really like these as like a planning book. They're filled with colored photos and a lot of historical content. It's not really a book I would bring with me, but it's one that I would buy before I go and really read up on. Also, a good driving map is essential if you're going to be driving in Portugal. We used to say in our guidebook that driving in Portugal is one of the most dangerous places in the world, and I think that was from the pre-EU days, because I wouldn't say that's true. I'd say it's actually a pretty easy place to drive, especially if you're used to driving around Seattle or any large city. Our website is a wealth of information, and we have a ton of free information online that you can go to. We have a travel forum here where you can go and ask questions and other travelers who maybe have been to this town. Let's say there's a town you found out that you have a grandmother from, and you look in all the guidebooks and you don't see anything listed about this town. You can answer a question, hey, my grandmother's from Aveiro. Anybody been there? And some person who lives in Aveiro might answer you and say, yeah, I'm from here. This is what you should see. Or someone else might say, I just got back and I stayed at this great hotel. These are some useful websites that I would suggest that I find quite useful. The first one is the Portuguese Tourism Office in the US, has a lot of wealth of information on Portugal, anything you want to find out. Portugal has a whole series of these historic inns called posadas, similar to paradors in Spain, if you've ever heard of those. And these are old convents and monasteries, sometimes castles. And they can be a bit on the pricey side, but they're kind of a unique hotel experience. And this website will list them all over the country. Also for rail schedules in Portugal, I use the Portuguese Railways website. And then there's several different bus companies, but these are the two main ones. Ava Bus and Rede Expressos, and then for budget flights, I use skyscanner.com. So Portugal is a lot of different ways to get around. It's kind of isolated from the rest of Europe because of Spain. Spain actually changed their rail gauges back in the 50s, and so it cut off Portugal from the rest of Europe by train. So you can't really travel to Portugal easily by train. There is a main rail line that runs from Lisbon to Madrid, an overnight train every night. A very old train that goes from Santiago in the north down to Porto, but just once a day. And there's a very old train that runs between Coimbra, the university town, and Salamanca, Spain, the university town in Spain. Also just goes once a day. So for the most part, you're going to want to rely on buses or maybe flights. You can fly very cheaply from various cities in Europe. For instance, last time I was in Portugal, I flew from Barcelona to Porto for about 20 bucks. On Ryanair. So if you book them ahead, they can be very cheap. There's a whole wealth of various airlines. That Skyscanner site will show you any number of them. So if you're going to be in Paris or you're going to be in Frankfurt, you could fly very cheaply often to a city like Porto or Faro or Lisbon and start your trips. So how you do your travel planning in Portugal really depends on how much time you have and what interests you have. What Rick sort of says in his book is if you had maybe 2 or 3 days, just do Lisbon. You'd fly there from some other city or maybe take an overnight train from Madrid, possibly a day trip to Sintra where the royal palaces are. If you had a week, I would say I would then, on top of Lisbon, either add the south coast, the Algarve coast, staying in a small town like Salema, one of Rick's little favorite backdoor towns, or possibly the north, do Lisbon, and then by north you could travel by train to Coimbra and Porto, the second biggest city. So train travel is really going to be between the large cities of Lisbon, Coimbra, and Porto, as well as down to the south coast and Évora as well. Otherwise, you're going to rely on buses or cars. So it really depends, on where you're going. The rail system here, this is the Portuguese rail system. It's not a very good map, but it shows the blue line is really the main line, the high-speed rail that they have in Portugal. Connects the major cities, and then these other lines are the smaller trains. They don't run quite as frequent as they're going to do in other countries like France or Spain. The high-speed trains in Portugal are called Alfa Pendulare trains, and they really connect the main core between Porto and Lisbon and Faro. The buses, Rede Expresso is one of the big companies, and this will connect the smaller towns as well as if you're heading to Spain. You can take a bus, for instance, from the south, Algarve, all the way to Sevilla. There's generally 2 to 4 a day. Cars are a really good option for getting around the countryside, especially the Algarve or maybe in the Douro Valley or the rural mountains to the east. I would say a smaller car is definitely better. You do need an international driver's license. You can get that at your local AAA office before you go. Also, some of the budget airlines I was referring to, this is Vueling, a Spanish airline. They have very inexpensive flights throughout Europe, but especially Iberia. There's a couple different cards that you might want to get in Lisbon and Porto, considering how much sightseeing you're going to do. The Lisboa card, for instance, in Lisbon, can really save a busy sightseer some time and money. It's going to cover all the major museums in Lisbon, and will cover public transit, so trolley cars, buses, funiculars, and the subway. And it will give you discounts on sites in Sintra. The Viva Viagem card here is a public transit card. So you buy this, it costs 50 cents, and then you put some money on it, and you use it like a zap system when you get on the subway, or you get on a bus, or you get on a trolley car. So it can really save you time, not having to buy tickets every time as well. The subway system in Lisbon is super modern and really easy to use. It connects the train stations, connects the airport, all the major sites you're going to want to use. And the subways are a pretty efficient way to get around town. You'll also see a bunch of trolley cars that go up and down the hills just like you would in San Francisco. And they have these modern trams that you might take out to Belém, one of the suburbs of Lisbon that has some sights to see. They also have these new little kind of Indian tuk-tuks. You'll see these all over the place in Lisbon. And you can hire them pretty inexpensively to take you up through town, to take you around. Lisbon's also a great taxi town. So you can hire taxis to take you pretty much anywhere you want to go. I always think it's important to learn a few phrases of the language when you're traveling. So even if you just learn these 3 phrases, you're going to go really far in Portugal. So Portuguese is related to Spanish, but it is definitely different. If you say hello in Portuguese, you say hola. Hola. Can everybody say hola? Hola. So it's similar to the Spanish hola, but it doesn't have the H, and it's stressed on the A. Hola for hello. Good day or good morning is bom dia. Bom dia. Bom dia. And then thank you, if you're a male, is obrigado. Obrigado. If you're a female, you would say obrigada. Obrigada. So obrigado and obrigada, depending if you're male or female. It doesn't matter if you're talking to a male or female. If I'm a man, I always say obrigado. If you are a woman, you will always say obrigada. So if you just learn these phrases, Portuguese people will just beam. They'll be so happy that you even attempt to speak their language. It's not a language that a lot of people speak. We do have some tours throughout Europe, and our Portugal tour will show you the highlights. So if you don't want to travel on your own, our Portugal tour can be a really good option to kind of see the main sites in Portugal. This map shows the nights that you will spend in each location. So it starts in Lisbon for 3 nights. You head down to Évora and the Alentejo for 1 night. Then up to the small town of Óbidos for 2, where you see some of these religious sites of Fatima, Alcobaça, and Batalha, as well as the beach town of Nazaré. Then you head to the university town of Coimbra for 2 nights, the Douro Valley for a night, and it ends in Porto. The only thing I don't like about this tour is that it does not go to the Algarve coast, which is one of my favorite locations. But it's very easy to remedy. After you do the Portugal tour, you can fly. There are 2 flights a day on Ryanair that go down to Faro. Very cheap if you book them ahead, less than $50. So what I usually recommend clients who are coming in for a consultation and they say, I'm doing the Portugal tour, what should I do afterwards? I would say, my first choice would be to fly down here and spend 3 nights in Salema. And then you could go to Faro and fly from Faro back to Paris or London or another city, or come back to Lisbon and fly home from Lisbon, depending on where you're going. So it's a really good way to kind of see what we consider the best of Portugal. We have some fantastic guides in Portugal. These are 3 of them. This is Maria Jose, Cristina Duarte, and Robert Wright. So some of the sites that I'm going to talk about today in Portugal, I'm going to start in Lisbon here, the capital. From there, we're going to head up to Coimbra, Porto, the Douro Valley, then down to Évora, and end at the Algarve. There's any number of ways that you can plan your trip to Portugal. I like to end it in the Algarve because this is one of my favorite places to relax. So I like to, I'll recommend people will fly into Porto and work their way down. But most flights are going to come in out of Lisbon, so you could do this any number of ways.